Okay. All right. Hey, thanks everyone. If you're tuning into this video, I really appreciate it. And if you have checked out my channel before or any of my other videos, I appreciate that as well. And if you like this video, then I would ask you to please demonstrate that you like it by actually liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Um, I hate to be one of those losers who starts off a video by saying that, but anyway, it's the world that we live in. So, what are we going to talk about today? I want to talk about something that I find myself discussing quite a bit. And I figured I would make a short video on it. And so, what I want to talk about today is the problems associated with what I call the Geopolitics 101 worldview. By extension, you could kind of also apply it to history and say, hey, there are a lot of problems with people who have a history 101 worldview. So, what do I mean exactly by this? There was a video that I put out a little over a year ago in which I went through my worldview. And if you haven't checked that out, just go to my channel. You can find the video that I put out. I don't remember the exact title, but I mean, it says the title is something like my worldview or something. It's pretty self-explanatory. You can find it pretty easily. But in that video, I just explain the way that I see the world. Now, you may or may not necessarily see the world the way that I do, and that's fine. And it's okay to have differences of opinion. But here's the issue: most Americans, most adult Americans have a highly unsophisticated view of the world, which fundamentally means they do not understand the levers of power. And because they fail to understand the true levers of power in the world, they're not optimally prepared to operate in the world in a way that benefits them, in a way that protects them, protects their families, protects their communities, protects their nations. And I'm most of the time when I talk, I'm referring to Americans just because I'm an American. That said, much of what I say applies across the world to people of many different nations, and certainly if anything that I say ever resonates with somebody outside the United States, then I'm all for it. I hope that that is the case. If I can ever put out some little nugget that anybody feels like is helpful to them, whether they're from the United States or not. So what I want to do is I want to kind of explain what I mean when I say the geopolitics 101 worldview. But to do that, I want to explain what geopolitics is just in a very normal sense, right? Just let's define the word. So I'm actually looking here and I can't find my hard copy of the book, but I actually really like this book. But it's a book by the author Parag Khanna, and it's called The Second World. And it's one of my favorite books, even though I think the author is quite a globalist, and I think it is a well-written book. I think there's a lot of great material in there, but it is absolutely written from a very normie perspective. Okay, which is kind of what I'm attacking in this video. So maybe it would seem strange to somebody that I would open up with a section from this book, but I'm going to explain why in a second. So anyway, I can't find my hard copy of this book because I've just moved so many times over the last, you know, 2 decades. But and I got this book a long time ago, but I do have a Kindle copy of the book, which is what I'm reading from. So the author of this book, again, the book is called The Second World, and the author is Parag Khanna. And he says geopolitics is the relationship between power and space. Geopolitics, geopolitics, power over space. I'm pretty sure you can see how we got there. Anyway, I like that. Very, very succinct. Doesn't belabor the point. Geopolitics, power over space. He goes on to say globalization refers to the widening and deepening interconnections among the world's peoples through all forms of exchange. Now, this is a great book. like I said, even though it's from a normie perspective, I do really like this book. I do think it's at least understand it's important to understand and be conversant kind of in the normie view of the world for reasons that I'll explain here in a moment. If you're unfamiliar with this book, I do like the book. I'm not going to explain what it's about. You guys can look it up. But there's one other point that I want to read here. This is from the preface of this book. And um, so he says, so let's see. So we just read about geopolitics and globalization. And this book is a lot about the relationship between geopolitics and globalization and where those two merge and clash. But he also says, kind of towards the end of the preface, he says, to comprehend the morphing spheres and vectors of influence, one must begin to think like a country, to slip into its skin. That's really interesting. Okay, this idea of thinking like a country. So we're going to come back to that point and why I think that is um why I think that's critical to the geopolitics 101 worldview, but also why it's a little bit problematic, why it's limiting to think like that. Also, what I say about geopolitics 101, as I said a minute ago, this could apply to history. It could certainly apply to theology, philosophy, and I think more and more, even science. So anyway, um, I have a book here that I want to share with you guys. So this is a book that I used when I was actually an undergrad in school. So it's called Understanding International Relations. So this is, I mean, I took international relations as a junior where I went to school. It was a required course. This is called Understanding International Relations, the Value of Alternative Lenses. And the reason that I want to share this with you guys is because so I find myself in conversations where I am criticizing people's worldview, and they criticize mine, and that's okay. But often what I find myself explaining to people is if you only have a geopolitics 101 level of understanding, then you do not know how the world works. Okay. So I've said it enough times, but let's kind of dive into what I mean by a geopolitics 101 level of understanding or history 101. And what I mean by that is if your understanding of history is what you got from high school, your history classes, your civics classes, your any political science class or international relations classes, which you probably didn't take as a high schooler, but you might have taken as an undergrad. Same thing. High school, undergrad, you're if that's your level of understanding with these subjects, you're not equipped to really truly grasp how the world works. But I would take it further. So if you have a grad degree in one of these disciplines, if you're still studying just the normie paradigm, then you are not going to understand how the world works. And I have a Substack that I wrote a while back, and it's actually called Fluent in Esperanto. So what's Esperanto? So Esperanto is this kind of manufactured language that was developed, and it was supposed to end up being kind of this worldwide lingua franca, that if everybody learned Esperanto, or if enough people learned Esperanto, then regardless of whatever your birth tongue was, you could communicate with all these other people because they also would know Esperanto. So it was a kind of like a deliberately constructed language. So I wrote a Substack a while back, and when I kind of used that as an analogy, and I said, there are a lot of people out there that are fluent in Esperanto, which means they are fluent in something that is artificial, that has been inorganically constructed, if that makes sense, right? In a way that languages don't develop. Languages develop organically through, a variety of factors over long periods of time. Esperanto is not like that. Esperanto is unique in that regard. So I kind of use this as an analogy, and I said, a lot of people are fluent, conversant in this artificial language. And what I meant was people's understanding of history, people's understanding of politics, people's understanding of the way in which the world works is not it's not grounded in reality. It's based on artificially constructed narratives, kind of like the artificially constructed Esperanto, hence the analogy. Now, here's where there's some limitations to that analogy. Nobody speaks Esperanto. I mean, how many people in the world speak Esperanto? Virtually nobody. Unfortunately, that's not the case when it comes to our narratives that people just tend to grab onto and then operate within when it comes to history, politics, etc. So that's where there's some limitations as to the application of my analogy, and I mentioned that in the Substack piece. I totally get that. But my point is that would you rather understand truth, or would you rather operate within something that has been, artificially created, an artificially created construct? Now, most people would say, well, I would rather operate in the world of truth. And yeah, that's the right answer. But you still have to understand that most other people don't necessarily operate within a paradigm that in any way accurately represents, the ground truth, right? And of course, none of us have a perfect paradigm. None of us can say to have a perfect understanding of the world works. Of course, and that should go without saying. But I will be the first one to say, of course, my own paradigm is limited. Of course, I have my own biases. Of course, I have my own, preconceptions, and it's my job to understand my own limitations, understand my own biases, and then work through those. And it's my job to be open-minded and refine my own thoughts. And as I come across new information or I balance out more competing ideas, it's my job to discard the ideas that no longer make sense, that no longer seem to be an accurate depiction of reality, and replace them with better ideas, ideas that seem to be more grounded in reality. And it's your job to do the same with your own ideas and your own thoughts and your own models of how the world works. But so Geopolitics 101. So we're looking here at this, this book that we used when I was an undergrad. And, if you took some sort of international relations class at your school too, then you probably used a book that's probably similar to this one. I'm not saying this book is any better or any worse than any other undergrad text for an international relations class. I'm just using this one because 20 years later, I still happen to have this book. And so I just pulled it off the shelf because I was curious as to what it said. All right. So I'm looking here in the introduction of this book. Again, this is an international relations textbook that I personally used when I was a junior in, school. So I was, whatever age you are when you're a junior in college. So, 2021, 22. So people who are in their very, very early 20s all across the United States are probably using texts in their undergrad institutions that are similar to this one. Maybe a little bit more updated since, I would have been reading this in 2001 to 2002. That's when I would have been a junior. Okay, so we have here in the introduction to this textbook, just a statement here. I'm just reading. It says, 2 central questions guide and focus this book. Why do states do what they do? And what causes conflict and cooperation among states? And that's pretty standard. If you talk about international relations to any degree, you're going to talk about this. But again, this is very state-centered. All right. Parag Khanna, in the preface to his book, The Second World, says, hey, you got to learn to think like a country. I don't entirely disagree with that, but I think we need to go a little bit deeper than that. Okay. Okay, let's turn the page. Why study international relations? What do these trends mean? International relations is as difficult to understand and analyze as it is important and fascinating. For example, consider the question, why did the USSR collapse and the Cold War end peacefully? This question contains three significant propositions. One, the USSR, a superpower and the leader of international communism, dissolved and ceased to exist as a state at the end of 1991. Two, Cold War, the fulcrum of international politics since World War II, fizzled out and evaporated. And three, these events, encompassing the dismantling of authoritarian regimes across Eastern Europe and the unification of Germany, happened peacefully. Not one of these three propositions was foreseeable, yet they occurred within a remarkably short period of time and provided the impetus for the emergence of an entirely new structure for international relations. Now, we're not going to talk about the Soviet Union tonight. I'm just using that because when I would have been using this textbook, the so-called collapse of the Soviet Union had only happened a decade earlier, right? And even now, I mean, it's still talked about because it was such a dominant event of the last, generation or so, even though it's been, 30 plus years. But again, according to the introduction of this book, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the other circumstances surrounding it were not foreseeable. Okay, is that true? Is that not true? We're not going to answer that with specific application to the Soviet Union, but let's think about that just in general terms. All right, so moving on. So just reading a little bit more. Introduction to the Foundations of International Relations. The scientific approach requires research into the general trends and patterns of international behavior. The accumulation of evidence from these techniques eventually leads to probability statements, theories, or laws that accurately describe and explain the actions of humankind beyond the boundaries of the nation state. All right, I'm skipping down a little bit. They begin by discussing the differences between the nation state and nation state and conclude by addressing non-state actors in the contemporary system. Okay. So even in this, very normie textbook, we're now at least allowing for the contributions of non-state actors into the system of kind of the way in which world politics operate. After determining which actors are interested in the accumulation and use of power, I mentioned power in the beginning, it becomes important to ensure that the term power has been defined as clearly as is possible, and this is no easy task. All right. There's one more thing that I want to read, one or two more things. A scientific study of world politics. Some people, especially the realists, we're not going to define exactly what that means in terms of international relations theory, but anyway, some people, especially the realists, with their insistence on the overwhelming importance of nation states as actors, stress the study of diplomatic history, the study of actions by national governments. Others, especially transnationalists, attend primarily to the study and development of international law. Okay, so maybe some competing ideas as to whether states are the dominant actors on the world stage, or whether it's more, the construction and the maintenance of international law. And then, of course, that would imply kind of the state's reaction to that, et cetera. Another approach, one not primarily associated with any of these philosophical perspectives, was to use relevant results and methods from the behavioral sciences, such as anthropology, economics, psychology, sociology. Skipping down a bit. The preference was to stress comparability rather than uniqueness, to look for patterns of behavior and for probabilities that certain behavior would occur. Skipping down. It's not like you guys are going to go run out and, purchase this textbook. And if you do, great, more power to you. But so I'm not super concerned about explaining, why I'm reading this or why I'm reading that. I'm just trying to give you a good appreciation for what you would find in just a typical international relations text that an undergrad student would be looking at. This is the last thing I'm going to read. That the study of international relations does not now, and may never look like physics with its apparent universal laws does not mean that international relations cannot be scientific. History is neither determined nor random. At any moment, it moves forward into an area whose general shape is known, but whose boundaries are uncertain in a calculable way. We are going to come back to that. To understand world politics, we need to have a high tolerance for uncertainty, the imperfect state of human knowledge, and the whys of human society and politics. The phenomena are extraordinarily complex, and we know far less than we would like. We have noted that theory, models, and concepts lead to the basic elements of science involving comparison, contingency, and probability. Now, I'm going to repeat something that I just read a minute ago. History is neither determined nor random. At any moment, it moves forward into an area whose general shape is known, but whose boundaries are uncertain in a calculable way. All right, so there's a continuum. According to this, on the one side, you would have history that is perfectly determined. It is fixed. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you would have history is perfectly random. It is not fixed in any way, and cannot be foreseen with any predictive quality whatsoever. And what this is saying is, well, it's neither. Neither of those extremes describe history. History is somewhere in the middle. And they go on to say, at any moment, it moves forward into an area whose general shape is known, but whose boundaries are uncertain in a calculable way. Now, that is a little bit worded a little bit weird because it says, all right, so kind of the general direction in which history is headed, according to this, is known. That is known. But the boundaries, are uncertain, but they're uncertain in a calculable way. So that's worded a little bit weird. So it's almost as if to say, you're headed in a direction that can be generally known. You don't exactly know the path, but you can at least know what you don't know. So the boundaries are uncertain, but they're uncertain in a calculable way. All right. So of everything that I read, that's all we're going to read in this this international relations text. There's a lot here that I agree with, and then there are things that I find ultimately problematic. But why do I find them problematic? Well, I find them problematic because I think they're limiting. And I think they're limiting because this approach to this approach to geopolitics is very state-centered. There's an issue with that. Okay. And it did mention non-state actors. So for example, if you talk to someone who has a degree in history or even an advanced degree in history, right? Or political science or international relations. Of course, they will entertain a paradigm that is complex enough that it will take into account certain actors that are not just, national level governments. Okay. For example, will they understand the contribution to world politics of transnational corporations? Sure. Or think tanks or other international bodies? Sure. Will they understand that even within a given country, there are competing priorities, corruption, perhaps divided loyalties, or espionage, or competing agendas, or different political parties? Yes. So those things are inherent to this understanding of the world for sure. Will individuals who kind of subscribe to this geopolitics 101 worldview, will they talk about the role of transnational corporations? Just these large super wealthy corporations around the world? Yes. Will they understand the role of large churches in shaping world politics? Yes. What about crime syndicates, whether it's, you know, mafias or drug cartels or terrorist networks, um, or other types of crime syndicates? Yes, they'll understand that, but only to a point. Okay, there will be things that are going to be missing in this type of worldview. So I'm going to pull out another book. Okay, so what's this book? So this book is called The Unseen Hand. All right, and this is so. Hold it here where you guys can see it. The Unseen Hand. Trying to make sure there's no glare. All right. The Unseen Hand, an introduction to the conspiratorial view of history. The author is A. Ralph Epperson. Hold it up one more time. All right, there you go. Okay. When I started looking into this stuff, this is one of the first books that I read. So I think I read this book. I'm going to guess that I read it in 2008. So I got this book. I read The Committee of 300 by John Coleman. It's actually right over there. I read that probably in about 2008. I also got the book Tragedy and Hope by Professor Carol Quigley, which is right back there. I would tell you that I've read that book, but let's be honest, that book's like 1,300 pages. I definitely have not read the whole thing, but it is a great reference, and it is right back there. Um, but I want to read something from the introduction to this book. And again, this is one of the first texts that I ever read, kind of moving into, again, the conspiratorial view of history. And I started finding books like this after I started to question things like 9/11. That was kind of my catalyst into realizing that, like, hey, things are not as they seem. So this is page 6 of this book. So I think this book is from 1985. I know the same author has another book that's quite well known that is simply called The New World Order. I do not have that book. I have not read that book. I have read this one, obviously. Anyway, so page 6, the introduction of this book from 1985. I'm reading here. All right. Wars start when one nation moves into the territory of another. Depressions occur when markets take unexpected downturns. Inflations occur when prices are driven up by shortages. Revolutions start when the people, always spontaneously, rise up to overthrow the existing government. These are the traditional explanations of historical events. Events happen by accident. There do not seem to be any causes. I don't necessarily like that. I don't think anybody believes that history is accidental. I don't really like that. I understand people talk about accidents of history. I got it. There could be like discrete singular events that could be quote unquote accidents, but even a very normie view of history, I don't like the term. I don't like describing that as an accidental view of history. I would prefer to call that an organic view of history, that events happen organically. Okay. Anyway, I understand what he's getting at. I just don't like the term accidental view of history. But all right, let's keep moving here. This explanation of history leaves gnawing questions in the minds of serious students. I'm a serious student. Are you a serious student? Okay. Is it possible that government leaders and others planned these events and then orchestrated them to their desired conclusions? Is it possible that even the great catastrophes of history were part of this plan? There is an explanation of historical events that answers these questions in the affirmative. It is called the conspiratorial view of history, and it is the alternative to the accidental view, the view that is commonly held today. It is possible, therefore, to summarize the major events of history into two alternative schools of thought. The accidental view of history. Historical events occur by accident for no apparent reason. Rulers are powerless to intervene. Let me keep reading. The conspiratorial view of history. Historical events occur by design for reasons that are not generally made known to the people. Now, I do agree that there are two competing schools of thought. I do not like the terminology accidental view of history. I think that's and I like this book. There's a couple issues that I have with the book, but um I don't think this is intentional on the part of the author. And I'm not saying this author is perfect or that this is a perfect text or whatever. That's not my point. Um I do like this book. I don't like the description of kind of the normie view, what I'm calling geopolitics 101, or in this case, maybe history 101. But to me, I would prefer to call that kind of this organic view. Events happen organically. That doesn't mean they happen accidentally. I think that's kind of an unintentional straw man here. Like nobody believes that historical events are quote unquote accidental. They still have causes. I mean, we just read about how in the international relations book, you can actually take a rigorous scientific approach to trying to take theories and apply them to what you see when it comes to politics. And you can then create a model that is some approximation of reality, whether it's a good one or a poor one, and then use that in theory to try and foresee future events with some measure of success or lack thereof. We will come back to that. But I don't entirely disagree with that. But I have problems with that. I'm going to describe those as we go. So anyway, so I would agree with the author that there are two views of history. One is an organic view, the other is a more conspiratorial view, where events are kind of made to happen or allowed to happen or steered in some way by design. All right, I'm going to keep reading here. This is on page 7. Okay. So Franklin D. Roosevelt, who certainly saw many monumental events occur during his consecutive administrations. President Roosevelt has been quoted as saying, "In politics, nothing happens by accident. If it happens, it was planned that way." Many of you are probably aware of that quotation. All right, I'm just skipping down a couple paragraphs. The first task of a conspiracy then becomes that of convincing the people that the conspiracy itself does not exist. I would agree. Then he goes on and he quotes Dr. Quigley. Of course, this is the professor from Georgetown who wrote the book Tragedy and Hope. So this is this author, Epperson, quoting Quigley in Tragedy and Hope, the book that I have back there. So this is Epperson quoting Quigley. There does exist and has existed for a generation an international Anglophile network, which operates to some extent in the way the radical right believes the communists act. In fact, this network, which we may identify as the roundtable groups, some of you will be familiar with that term, kind of the roundtable and what that means. We're not going to go there right now. In fact, this network, which we may identify as the roundtable groups, has no aversion to cooperating with the communists or any group, and frequently does so. I know, now again, the I here is Quigley. I know of the operations of this network because I have studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years in the early 1960s to examine its papers and secret records. I, Quigley, have no aversion to it or most of its aims, and have, for much of my life, been close to it and many of its instruments. I have objected, both in the past and recently, to a few of its policies, but in general, my chief difference of opinion is that it wishes to remain unknown, and I believe its role in history is significant enough to be known. Okay, so Epperson is quoting Quigley as, by the way, Quigley was also a mentor of Bill Clinton. Anyway, so Epperson is quoting Quigley as saying, hey, there's this secret apparatus of power, which he kind of refers to as this Anglophile network. But it has a lot of power, and it operates in secrecy to steer certain events on the world stage. And Quigley is saying, I don't have a problem with that. My problem with that is I don't think it needs to be secret. He says, hey, sure, maybe I've had some quibbles with this policy or that policy, but on the whole, I don't have an issue with what they're doing. I just think that their role in world history and politics is significant enough that it should be known. I'm going to keep reading. So this is Epperson now, and he says the ultimate purpose of this conspiracy is power. Okay, so where are we at? So two competing views of geopolitics, history, etc. Okay. Epperson would call one view the accidental view. I don't like that term. I would prefer to call it the organic view for reasons I've already explained, so I won't go into again. But it's also what I mean when I just referred to, geopolitics 101 or history 101. Okay. And by 101, I don't mean just an introductory level class. I'm also including in that people who may have advanced degrees in history, but it's only from kind of this, normie view, which means they still have an ultimately flawed and limited paradigm, which means they can't optimally operate in the real world where we live, protecting their own interests, protecting their families, communities, nations, etc. Okay. I'm clicking back over here because I actually have a couple of notes that I made. So I'm just making sure I don't get lost and just start talking about nonsense here, which I certainly can do. Okay, so with this geopolitics 101 view, I'm not trying to create a straw man here. I'm not saying that people only think like a country and they only think about state actors. I understand that many of these people, they understand some of these other complexities. So yes, they understand everything that I mentioned before, the corruption, the politics, the various level of politics in their own countries, divided loyalties, self-interest, people taking bribes, acts of espionage. I totally understand all of that. And human beings are complex. I get that too. They will also understand large transnational corporations, some of which are very wealthy and wield more influence than some countries. That's true. They will understand the influence of churches, crime syndicates. I mentioned all that. But they still may not necessarily understand the true interplay of all of those or other types of actors on the stage, which wield a lot of power. Well, what about secret societies, which in many circumstances are far more than just fraternal orders? What about secret societies that infiltrate some of those other institutions that I already mentioned, whether it's political parties, whether it's churches, whether it's think tanks, whether it's some of these supranational organizations like the United Nations or the World Economic Forum. You've also got, other groups that operate a little bit more in secrecy, though most people today have heard of, like, the Bilderberg Group. Most people have heard of, like, the Davos Group, etc. The Trilateral Commission. These also have a lot of power, and a lot of times they steer policies in the direction that they want them to go. But who controls them, right? What about the influence of extremely wealthy families? So in the United States, when we talk about wealthy families, we're talking about families who have wealth that has maybe been accumulated over decades, even if it's a lot of decades, maybe a century, maybe a little bit more than a century at the most. But what about wealthy families that have accumulated wealth over millennia? Do those exist? Are they out there? Do they have a lot of influence? Do they operate behind the scenes? How extensive would their influence be? So the difference kind of between these two paradigms is there are limitations to the first, kind of that geopolitics 101 worldview, because they don't necessarily attribute a lot of overly deterministic power to some of these other groups or to some sort of overarching architecture that steers the majority of these events. So if you believe that there is some sort of network or some sort of patchwork of various networks that creates some sort of architecture whose tentacles are in most of the institutions across the world. If you believe that's largely how the world operates, then I would say that you don't necessarily completely buy into the Geopolitics 101 worldview, because the Geopolitics 101 worldview does not account for things like that. Certainly not to that degree, where they think that there is some sort of worldwide apparatus that maybe not doesn't necessarily hold, absolute power, but that holds effective power. Let's just, word it like that. So the Geopolitics 101 worldview doesn't necessarily account for that, at least not to any appreciable degree, to where they would attribute to it some overly deterministic level of power. If you believe that there is some sort of apparatus like that, or a patchwork of various networks that together create some sort of global apparatus of control like that, even if it doesn't necessarily result in absolute control, but effective control, then yeah, I would say then you don't subscribe to the Geopolitics 101 worldview. And in my mind, you have a much more accurate belief that more closely approximates reality, at least in my view. Because I do believe that, that apparatus and whatever its exact form is, but I do believe that that exists. I think it's really hard to understand exactly what it looks like. And, people, of course, are going to ask you, well, explain how, who are these people, et cetera. And you got to read a lot of books, and you got to come up with a lot of people's descriptions of exactly, who these folks are, what their groups are. And it's just hard to try and figure out exactly how all that works. But it doesn't mean that those steering groups that manipulate and engineer events on the world stage, it doesn't mean that those don't necessarily exist. Now, with that said, I do think that you have to kind of be conversant in the Geopolitics 101 paradigm, because that's who you're interacting with. And here's the other thing. You got to remember how many Americans don't even read. You got to remember how many Americans are not even well versed in the paradigm that I'm critiquing. The paradigm that I'm critiquing at least assumes that an adult American has some level of understanding of even the normie narrative of history. But there are a lot of Americans who don't even necessarily understand the normie narrative of history, as flawed as it is. They can't remember what they learned in high school. Can't remember, when's the last time they read a book? I mean, that's the majority of Americans. They're not even necessarily at the Geopolitics 101 level, but certainly, plenty of Americans are. They are well read. But they're reading texts a lot of times that reinforce this normie narrative, this Geopolitics 101 view. Okay. What does the term deep state mean? Or a term that isn't used as often, but deep politics. Or what about the term deep events? So there's a guy, another professor. This is Peter Dale Scott. Maybe you've heard of him, maybe you haven't. This is one of his books. It's called The American Deep State. The subtitle is Wall Street, Big Oil, and the Attack on U.S. Democracy. Now, I have a couple of books by Peter Dale Scott, and he's written, I don't even know how many books he's written. I have a couple of them, but he's written quite a few. He is widely considered to be the guy who popularized the term deep state. He did not coin the term. Okay. But that's not, kind of neither here nor there as to where the term was first used or whatever. But he would say that it actually came from Turkey. So anyway, I am looking at this book. This is chapter 1 of this book. Again, the title of this book is The American Deep State. He has plenty of other books, and I would say that the deep state, deep politics, deep events, these are recurring themes that you will find throughout many of his books. All right. Okay. Power. I'm reading from page 3, chapter 1, just the middle of the page. Power in the dark is the essence of what I, meaning Peter Dale Scott, borrowing in 2007 a term from Turkey, meant by the deep state. I'm going to read that again. Power in the dark is the essence of what I, borrowing in 2007 a term from Turkey, meant by the deep state, a power not derived from the Constitution, but outside and above it, more powerful than the public state. Okay. Power in the dark is the essence of what I, borrowing in 2007 a term from Turkey, meant by the deep state, a power not derived from the Constitution, but outside and above it, more powerful than the public state. All right. Well, that's interesting. So let's keep reading here. Okay, so this is chapter 2. I'm on page 12. The political activities of the deep state are the chief source and milieu of what I have elsewhere called deep politics. All those political practices and arrangements, deliberate or not, which are usually repressed rather than acknowledged. Now I'm going to go on. This is the term deep state, originated in Turkey in 1996 to refer to United States-backed elements, primarily in the intelligence services and military, who had repeatedly used violence to interfere and realign Turkey's democratic political process. Sometimes the definition is restricted to elements within the government or a state within a state, but more often in Turkey, the term is expanded for historical reasons to include members of the Turkish underworld. In this chapter, I shall use deep state in the larger sense to include both the second level of secret government inside Washington and those outsiders powerful enough in either the underworld or overworld to give it direction. In short, I shall equate the term deep state with what in 1993 I termed a deep political system, one which habitually resorts to decision-making and enforcement procedures outside as well as inside those publicly sanctioned by law and society. Now I'm going back a couple of pages. Let's see. Okay. These forces, this would mean, deep state forces, are those that produce deep events. Okay. All right. What's going on here? So again, that's Peter Dale Scott. Okay. The book is The American Deep State. He has a lot of other books. Some of the central themes of his writings are the deep state that operates amid deep politics and orchestrates, deep events. There's another term sometimes that you'll see, which is basically akin to deep politics, which is parapolitics. And remember, these aren't just American terms. They've they've gained a certain level of usage in the United States over the last couple of decades, and especially in the last decade. So if you remember, during Trump's first term, we used to hear, a lot of talk about this, the deep state. I don't really like that usage of the term because I think that is a misapplication. I think the term has been misapplied in the last decade or so. I do understand it in the way that Peter Dale Scott uses the term. And I like how he says there's the part of the deep state that is a state within a state. So that's inside the structure of the government. But it's not limited to that. It also exists in these other institutions that also have a hold of these other levers of power. But now let's take that and let's internationalize it. And let's think about, because remember, is it important to think like a country? Yes, but instead of just thinking about the public state when we think like a country, let's think like the deep state. But let's take it one step further. We don't want to just think like a country. That's too limiting. Got to understand too that we need to internationalize that concept. So think like a global empire that is exerting its influence worldwide. Think about that deep empire structure. I think that is much more helpful. Now, what exactly are deep events? So, deep events would be the events that have either alternative explanations as to exactly what occurred. I mean, think about all the events that are performed by intelligence services all around the world for a variety of reasons. But also, there are different types of these events. Remember, there are events that are done a lot of times by intelligence services in which you try and conceal the operation. All right. And then there are other types of deep events that are done in which you conceal the actor who performed that operation. So some of you will understand that there's a difference between covert or clandestine activities that we don't necessarily have to go through that distinction here, um but it is important to understand that at times you're not even necessarily disclosing that some sort of operation occurred. Other times an operation will occur, but you're making sure that the actor is unknown, or you are attributing a certain operation to another actor, to an actor that did not actually perform that operation. So if you're familiar with the concept of a false flag, obviously one type of deep events would be false flags, which have happened so many times in so many different countries for so many different reasons, even just throughout the last century or so. Okay. So I feel like I've probably meandered quite a bit in trying to explain what it is that I wanted to talk about today, but I hope this kind of at least makes some sense. And I'm going to try and sum up by saying this. I agree with Epperson. There are two primary schools of thought when it comes to kind of, geopolitics and history. Okay. There's the normie narrative, which he calls this accidental view of history or geopolitics. I don't like that. I don't think it's accidental. I think it's organic. But that's what I'm referring to when I say kind of this normie narrative of history or politics, which I call kind of, geopolitics 101. And then there is the more conspiratorial view. That's just the way that I think the world works for reasons that I'm not necessarily going to go into right now. But I think that is a much better, much more accurate description of how the world works. Now, those views clearly are in competition with one another. And this is before we even start talking about kind of within that normie school of thought. Of course, if you study international relations, you're going to study a lot of theories that attempt to provide explanatory power for why certain, world events occur. I get that. But all those competing theories, and I'm not saying they're entirely without merit, but they're all housed within that kind of geopolitics or history 101 paradigm. They do not attribute overly deterministic power or control to some sort of, global or virtually global apparatus that exercises significant management of the world's population, resources, etc. Okay. So that's kind of the chief difference between the two. Why is it necessary that we have an accurate understanding of the way the world works? And I said before, when I opened the video, you can't adequately operate in the world if you don't understand the environment that you're working in. If you do not understand who the actors are that are operating in your environment. But here's the other thing. When you think about strategy, so I have a Substack that I called um, I think I called it the phenomenology of war. And I think the subtitle was Deep War. Okay. And when I use that term deep war, I'm using it in the way that Peter Dale Scott is using the term, deep state, deep events, deep politics. I'm just kind of applying the same concept analogically to war, which I think is um, I, I think that we do not understand war, and we do not understand the way in which it is used to steer events. I think people understand that war is used to steer events. I think that collectively we do not understand how. Okay, so I kind of in a Substack that I wrote, and then also in a video on this channel, which I did, I kind of explained my concept of deep war, and it's a concept that I'm still working through. So it's not complete. It's not I would say extremely well hashed out. I'm still kind of working through it mentally. But if we're in a deep war, and I completely believe that we are, now again, war is a much broader term than the way most people think of it when they think of, because most people have a war 101 type understanding of it. And they think, well, if there aren't guns, tanks, bombs, and explosions, then you're not in a war. Okay, well, war is much broader than that. Let's step outside of the war 101 box. So we're in a deep war. Okay, go find that Substack or that video to get an explanation as to what exactly I mean by deep war. But if we're in a deep war and we want to be victorious, and we do, at least I do, then it's important that we employ a deep strategy. But to employ a deep strategy, you have to take your strategic framework, right? But you have to apply it to the environment that you're operating in, to the situation that you're in. And you have to understand the variables that are at play. So even when I looked at this textbook for international relations, it does say, hey, there are ways in which you can apply the rigors of typically what we think of as the hard sciences to international relations. Now, that I agree with. I just don't think they do that. If you're in the normie school of thought, I don't think that you do that as rigorously as you think you do. I think there are variables that you miss because your paradigm is limited. So I think that when you look at the worldwide system, there are inputs into that system that you miss if you still subscribe to this geopolitics 101 understanding. You're going to miss certain inputs that are entered into the system, and therefore you will miscalculate the impacts or the effects that they produce in the system. All right. So again, do I think that you could try to achieve certain models that to some degree would allow for some predictive quality of future events? Yeah, probably with a reasonable degree of success, but only if your model is as accurate as possible. Well, how is your model going to be as accurate as possible? Well, you got to understand the world that you're actually, working in, and you can't miss some of these variables or misattribute the meaning of these variables because you don't understand what's going on. And this is what happens with a lot of people who their worldview, there's a disconnect between the way that they believe the world works and then what they see on the ground. Okay. Now, the good news is for a lot of people, when that happens, they go back and they reevaluate their worldview, and that's what happened to make me start reading books like, some of these that I've read. And again, I would never tell you that I have a perfect or even a great understanding of the world works. I am still on the path to try and figure this out, as well. Um, but when you have a worldview and then it kind of bumps up against reality and you realize I can't account for what I'm seeing, then in an attempt to try and account for what you're seeing, if you're not willing to kind of challenge your own assumptions and perhaps refine your worldview, if you're not willing to do that, then you're going to have to try and find explanations that are offered to you by the school of thought that you subscribe to. And that's why you get people who they see what's happening and they're like, I don't understand why this world leader or why the leader of this country is doing that, because it doesn't seemingly make sense. That individual must be incompetent. Yeah, maybe, or maybe there's another reason. Now, do I believe that some leaders at kind of the mid-tier levels in the actual pyramid of power, do I think some of them are incompetent? Yeah, but I do not believe that the people in the true pyramid of power, in the world, whatever that real pyramid of power looks like, the higher and higher you get to the top, I do not believe that those people are incompetent. Diabolical, yes. Evil, yes, but they are not incompetent. Now I've talked about power because I believe that geopolitics is this is where I agree with Parag Khanna that a good look at geopolitics is understanding the relationship between power and space. So for me, I believe that ultimately your power resides with God. I'm a believer in that. So um, I'm not overly concerned with those who wield worldly power, except that we do live in this world. Um, I would love for my friends, my family, my community, my country, but also, mankind. I would like for people to live in peace, and I would like for people to be able to, um, engage in trade and commerce and peaceful activities and learn and be truly educated. I'm not predicting any of that's going to happen. I mean, I'm not being unrealistic here, but that's still an ideal that I wish would happen. And so, do I think that there are people out there that are my enemies and your enemies? Yes. Do I think that the people that are our truest enemies operate within the shadows? Yes. Do I think that they ultimately try and hide behind the actions of other people between us and them? Yes. Will they sometimes mask their activities by putting several layers of, bureaucracy and seeming incompetence in between us and them? Yes. So I think that incompetence can sometimes shroud what is actually happening, but I do believe that the people who have a lot of power on the world stage are not at all incompetent. Now, I don't pretend to know exactly how they work, how exactly they maintain all their power. This video is not to create the illusion that I do understand that perfectly or even extremely well. It's just to communicate to you that I think there are some limitations in the geopolitics 101 paradigm. And I think that it is something that if more people would come to realize those limitations, then more people would start to adopt a much more realistic model of how the world works. And we could all then learn from each other and come away with a better understanding of the levers of power on the world stage, which then means that we could all employ better, more optimal strategies for how we could all prosper, grow closer to God, engage in more peaceful conduct with one another, etc. So that's kind of the underlying reason as to why I'm making this video, or why I make, all these videos in general. So, hey, thanks for tuning in. Sorry that I was long-winded, probably a little bit more long-winded than I meant to be. You guys can let me know in the comments if any of this made sense. I did make some notes and try to follow them, because otherwise I know myself, and I know that I can veer off track here. So I try to keep myself on track as much as possible. If you like this video, please, hit like, subscribe to the channel if you would. That'd be great. And then go back and check out my video where I explain my worldview, because in some ways, this is kind of a follow-up to that. In some ways, I think I'm a little bit more descriptive about it in that video. And then go check out my Substack that's called Fluent in Esperanto. And then go check out my video and my Substack on deep war. I think the Substack itself is called The Phenomenology of War. I will put those links in the description, but I appreciate you checking this video out. Thanks so much. See you next time.